Hello, my name is Reiser Robbins. I'm an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Texas A&M University-Kingsville, where I also am co-coordinator of the Southwest Borderland Studies and Mexican American Studies programs. It is my pleasure to be here along with my husband, Dr. Mark Robbins, Professor of History at Del Mar College. For many of us, food is symbolically at the heart of our family, it's at the heart of our heritage, and it's something that connects us in our present moment across our family members and our communities, but also back through generations and down through to future generations. Tonight, we'll explore some of the meanings that food has for us. We'll look at examples of the way in which food figures prominently in the memories and in the experiences of individuals who are farm workers, who we have interviewed as part of the South Texas Hispanic Farm Labor Oral History Project. We'll look at the ways in which food is intimately tied to our identity. And finally, we'll look at ways in which these themes of identity and belonging and family come together through living recipes, a way to archive and examine those recipes, those dishes that we hold dear to one another. And we'll take a look at some of the ways that you might, in your own home, think about preserving and cataloging your family's meals. Food can be a history lesson for us as we sit in our family's kitchen, as we listen to the ways in which our grandmother or our aunt or our uncle teaches us the right way, the proper way to barbecue or to make bread in the ways and traditions that they received. Many of us have heard the expression, "you are what you eat," right? A French gastronomist said it very eloquently and provocatively, I think. "Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you what you are." Food for us is something that creates social unity. It brings us together around a shared space. It's something that we consume with one another. And in this way, it's something that is a unifying force for us. It becomes a marker of cultural identity and a symbol and a sort of communication device for us. There are subtle messages in everything food related, down to and including the aesthetics of the foods that we consume. These themes, in which food becomes a form of communication, a message, and a unifier for us across social bonds, are two additional themes that we'll explore as we think about food and heritage. If you are what you eat, the aesthetics of the images that you see before you by artist and photojournalist Greg Segal are very striking. He set about over a course of several years to document what children around the world eat in a given week. And he photographed them with their meals surrounding them. I encourage you to Google Daily Bread by Greg Segal and to read through the different countries and societies that he has documented here, to look at their dietary practices, to think about and reflect on differences that you see. Some of those are reflections of history, as we just talked about. Some of those are reflections of aesthetics and symbolism, and some of them are reflections of the very complex global world in which we exchange food today. These themes may be global, they may be national, but ultimately they're intimate and local because they're experienced right in our own households, in our own families, and in our own heritage. And because they're shared experiences, they're things that connect us. So we're going to look thematically at some of these different ways of thinking through the meaning of food by focusing on vignettes. And we'll start by taking a look at the way in which memories of food, sensory memories, taste memories, family memories figure prominently in the recollections of individuals who grew up as members of Hispanic farm labor communities in Nueces and Clayburgh counties and in South Texas broadly.
As Dr. Reiser Robbins mentioned, food carries deep significance to individual families, and there are many different windows through which we could explore that. And one of those that we'll consider today is an oral history project that we've had the pleasure of co-directing, the South Texas Hispanic Farm Labor Community's Oral History Project. This is a public heritage project that involves many different things, but the main component is recording oral histories of those who had worked in the fields here in South Texas, focusing particularly on Nueces County and the surrounding regions. And the idea behind this project is that these voices are very important in elucidating often underrepresented perspectives in the historical record. We often have the perspectives of farm owners and growers, and in the historical record, oftentimes we are lacking at least a sufficient degree of the voices of those who had labored in the fields. And so what we'll see here are deep recollections not only of what that labor was like, but also how food is connected to it and how food is connected to family life. Oftentimes when we take an oral history and narrators are generous enough to share it, we learn not just about, labor on the fields, but a broader discussion of their lives and what is important to them. And as we mentioned, food can really be at the crosshairs of the social practices, the cultural practices of families in South Texas and beyond. So here are a few examples. In the tradition of the Oral History Project that is aiming to bring to historical presence the stories and words of the respondents themselves, let's read a couple of quotes that are particularly rich from the Oral History Project in conveying these broader meanings. So here's the first one, kind of illustrating the nature of the labor conditions that many went through. When they went, they had lunch at noon. Either my mom would take those little large buckets, how they use, I think that they still do, buckets full of tacos, wrapped in a dish towel or whatever. A great big jar of Kool-Aid. It tasted good and it went down good after working in the sun. So with this quote, we see that the conditions were harsh. We see what it's like working out in the sun to a certain degree, but also how food could offer a respite as for families from those difficult working conditions. One of many examples showing, again, how domestic spaces where we commonly think of food consumption and spaces on the job, the fields themselves, are intertwined, but how that space of comfort could still be there. Another example here. There was no sharing of, if it was man's work, it was man's work. And if it was women's work, it was women's work. And so I think what strikes me the most is that she woke up every morning, possibly 5-something, to cook a breakfast and to prepare lunch, whether that involved a hot lunch or a cold lunch. So she had to prepare breakfast for everyone, referring to her mother. And during this time, decades back, even more so than today, popular culture and societal practices often placed women in domestic roles, suggesting that it was the job primarily of women to prepare meals, to serve meals, and that these meals would be a critical element of family life. And in the case of this oral history project, one of the things that we noticed was not only the presence of those cultural attributes or cultural practices, but also by economic necessity, oftentimes the women who were preparing food were also out working in the fields. So we can see these distinctive gender roles that were part of many families' lives on display. Another example, his family, referring to the former husband of the oral history narrator, was a large family, and they migrated for a large part of his life. When he and I were married, if I made some refried beans, he would make a taco, flatten it, and put it in the refrigerator. He said he enjoyed eating a cold fried bean taco because it reminded him of his youth, because that's what they would eat in the field. But by the time they would get to eat lunch, it was already cold. So I just thought that was so funny, that was a sensory memory that he was nostalgic about. And when he could have had a fried bean taco that was hot, he made sure it was cold when he ate it, because that would take him back to those days. So here food, again, conveys this broader meaning, even across many decades, where it could be a sensory device to convey what family life was like back then, in this case, in his youth. So even though the conditions on the field involved everything from low pay to the heat to any number of other struggles, what we also noticed in the oral history recollections is that many of the narrators took pride in being able to contribute to their families and being able to work alongside of their families. Even when this meant there was very little time to spend outside of the fields. So these moments where they could share food, where they could converse, whether it be under a rare place of shade or out in the hot sun, or even at times under a truck for some of the kids who recalled where they could find that shade, it was still a moment of family interactions, and food at the crosshairs of it, even at the crosshairs of memory. One oral history respondent recalled, "My younger sister picked up the last one and she was just eating, and I said, I wanted that. And my grandmother said, look, you'll be a lot fuller if you share. You'll be happier. She cut it in half and gave us each a half, and we thought we all wanted a whole one. But she said, you'll feel a lot fuller if you share." And so I never forgot her saying that. And I tell my sister, remember, she said we would be a lot fuller, but we weren't. I said, but now we are. And she said, now I'm happy when I share with you. So it's through these kinds of moments where the shared meal, the desire for, we can all relate to the desire of having something that a sibling or another family member currently possesses, but that desire to share is something bigger than that, and it's something taught in an intergenerational context here through the sharing of food. Now, speaking of those values, they're not only within families as a point of sharing here, but also at a societal level, and that too was conveyed in a number of the oral history recollections. Here's one example. My grandmother would get all the women together in the kitchen and make tamales, and while they were making tamales with all the women chatting and talking, my grandmother would talk about all these issues of social equality that were important. It was like in her home she would carry on a crusade. So here she's talking about an environment where, when we think of activism for better working conditions, for greater equality, combating discrimination, we often think of people holding signs in front of the Capitol, in front of the White House, so these sort of formal spaces of political activism. But what happens before that? How did people come together? How did they come to collaborate? Well, maybe over food preparation, or at the dinner table for that matter, or out sharing a meal at the place of work, whether in the fields or elsewhere. And in this case, considering the gender roles that often suggested who was supposed to be performing what kind of labor for food, this oral history respondent's grandmother got women together, made tamales, as was common practice in her community, and talked about the issues, collaborated across households through these kitchens, and then went on to be part of a major organization that fought for meaningful civil rights changes on the basis of this powerful work done behind the scenes.
Now we turn to an important aspect of food and heritage, which is in some ways paradoxical, and it's the very vulnerability of food practices and food knowledge. Sometimes we don't have access to oral histories, or we don't have written down in our archival records the ways in which people thought about food. In fact, for most of us, recipes, our cooking practices, these are ephemeral things. They're things that we do and that we act out, that we use muscle memory for. But we don't necessarily have them preserved in their totality. Recipes, our ways of cooking, is a performance of ancestral culinary tradition that's played out in everyday life. It's a form of living history and a living expression of culture. And we turn now in our last vignette to thinking about some of the ways that we can capture all of those different dimensions and meanings of food in an active way through a concept of living recipes. A quote that I really like by Gillian Crowther highlights for us just how involved cooking and food really are. Crowther writes, "Cooking is about much more than just making food. It is the aesthetics, combination of ingredients, skill, and the interplay of the senses, together with an image, either imagined or illustrated, of what the food should look like when it is finished." This image, a painting by Carmen Lomas Garza, an artist from Kingsville, is called Tamalada, and it is her family gathered together in the kitchen making tamales. And this family process, which involves so many members of her family, brings together ancestral traditions in one and all of the senses as they come together to create something, a product, the image of which is imagined before it's created, and yet it comes together in a dynamic way, changed each time by the presence of who's there and who contributes, the conversation that happens around the cat right in the corner who's there. This for us is a wonderful kind of example of a living recipe and the need for a living recipe, a way to capture and understand the meaning that food practices hold and why it is so important for us to preserve for our cultural and family heritage. As part of a class I teach called Food, Thought, and Culture, my students have conducted living recipes, a kind of combination of an instruction manual for how to create a particular dish, the ingredients that are involved, and the process by which you combine them to create a particular food, but also the contextual nature of that recipe, from whom the cook learned it, when they make it, how they make it, why they make it, how they serve a particular dish, what happens when they serve it. All of these kinds of elements beyond the physical product itself, the food, that speaks to the meaning that it holds. And these living recipes, part oral history, part recipe, come together to create a really dynamic and important lens into a particular family, and by extension, into the community and the heritage of a region. So I have for you a few examples of these living recipes and some of the themes that they highlight for us about why food is so important to us. The first is this notion that cooking and food preparation is something that happens through a kind of embodied apprenticeship. So one woman asked her mother, "Who taught you how to make this kind of rice?" And it was a rice that she called mama's rice or Mexican rice. And the response of her mother was, "My grandma did. I would watch her cook when I was small, and when I got older, she would tell me to be in the kitchen so I could learn to cook. Whenever I would forget, I would just call her and ask her to remind me." Learning cooking is about enculturated experience. It's something that you perform through watching, through participating and slowly acquiring the skills necessary to produce food. In this way, it's something that we say kind of lives in the senses. So the interviewer goes on to ask her mother, "When you taught me how to make rice, why didn't we use a recipe card like the rest of our dishes?" And her mom responded, "That's because my mother never wrote down the recipe, because we learned how to weigh things with our hands and measure the spices by taste." It lives in the senses. It's performed through actions, through time, and something that's slowly acquired through those necessary skills to produce food. In this way, recipes may exist as people's intellectual but also practical knowledge. And they come in some instances to have a kind of autobiographical quality. It's mom's rice, right? Or as she called it also, Mexican rice. But she referred to it mostly as mom's rice. And here you'll see the description of the ingredients needed and then the instructions for what you do with those ingredients to make mom's rice. But you'll also notice that these elements are part of a lived experience of a culture. They're recorded in memory through successive performances. Each time it's iterated over and over, but they're also adaptable. They're adaptable and changeable because of changing practices over time, because of changing technologies, because of differences in ingredients and what's available to you, and differences in taste. So you'll notice that at the end of this recipe, where there's a little asterisk that says, you can add other things, right? You can add carrots, you can add peas for something different. Recipes or dishes or our food practices may have a kind of autobiographical quality, but they're not something that emerges all at once. And instead, what's so interesting about food practices and food heritage is that a lot of times the depth or extent of a person's repertoire, right, their menu, if you will, isn't revealed all at once. It's something that is added to over time, and it's dynamic in that way. Another interviewer asked a relative, she said, "If you could choose, what food or meal would you say is significant to you and your family?" So she didn't define first what recipe she wanted to know. She sought out a family member who she associates as being a food provider in her family, a kind of caretaker of the kitchen, and asked that family member to define for herself what was most significant. And the response that she got from her grandmother was, "Well, there are so many meals that I could choose from, but since we will soon get our first real cold northern, I have to say caldo de pollo, which, as you know, is a Mexican-style chicken soup." And the student went on to ask, "Is this a meal you make at any time, or is there a specific time, day, or tradition that you make it?" She's building that contextual information about the dish, not just the ingredients, but when and how and why it's served, the meaning behind it. And her grandmother responded, "You can make it whenever. Most people, including myself, tend to make it during the colder seasons to keep warm or for their loved ones who are sick. We've always seen it as an ailment to heal those who have colds because it makes the ill feel better and rids the sniffles fast. Although it is not a food most people relate to holidays or special times, for myself and my family, caldo has become something of a tradition to make on the first real northern here in South Texas." And in this way, recipes or dishes or food heritage is triggered from memory as seasons pass. Recipes may come up as holidays come up, as specific moments happen in a person's life, whether it's an illness or a celebration, a major life occasion, or even just the passing of the seasons. The process of speaking to someone and asking them for this contextual information, when and how and why a dish is prepared and served and given, to whom it is offered, recalls for us most vividly the meaning of food. And I've highlighted meaning there to emphasize the profound depth of emotion that we hold towards these food practices, what they convey to us. Our recipes, our foods, the taste, the smells, they trigger memories, positive and negative, nostalgic and sad. They're a way to bring together, all wrapped up in one particular place, in one particular dish, this wealth of meaning for a family. And yet, as intimate, as personal, as profound as those meanings are, in many ways, our food is vulnerable to loss. Recipes aren't often preserved, or they may be preserved but only in piecemeal form, where you have the ingredients, you have the temperature at which to cook them, the order in which to prepare them, but not where it was learned from, how that memory got passed down, how you learned what a pinch of salt meant, right? Or when you season it to taste, to whose taste, right? All of those additional details that give richness and meaning and heritage to a particular food. One question that the young woman who asked her mother about mom's rice said is, why have you never written it down, right? And her mom's response is, because I still have memory of how to do it. And I don't have the need to do it because I already showed my daughters how to make grandma's rice. And that idea of embodied apprenticeship, of learning by doing, of being in the kitchen, of feeling it with your hands, of you yourself experiencing how to create something is so valuable. And it gets at those ways in which food creates social unity, the bonds that our last interviewee just referenced. And yet, that may mean that what's so important in our life gets overlooked, right? These things which are a kind of inalienable wealth, a cultural property, and this important aspect of our culture may not get archived, may not get preserved, may not get passed down. The recipes, the familiar taste of a dish, the connection felt between people who share a particular heritage. These are the things which can be contextualized, which can be encapsulated through something like a living recipe. Even though each cook's recipe may differ, it will share culinary links with those around them, with their other family members, with their region, with their heritage. And through these recipes and food traditions, you can gain a sense of personal and cultural identity. A living recipe brings all of these elements together. It combines an oral history, it combines the ingredients, it combines the process, it combines the visual. It might even involve you in the kitchen and eating the products. You can ask any questions you like, but typically questions include, what does this dish mean to you? Who did you learn it from? How old were you when you learned it? How did you learn it? Do you know where the person before you learned it from? How long have they been making it, or has it been in the family? For what occasions do you make this dish? Are there particular times of year or particular holidays? What do you find challenging about making the dish? Or what are the things that create tension as you create and serve it? How do you serve it? When do you serve it? To whom do you serve it? These are the kinds of questions that precede the dish and then that are enjoyed as the dish is enjoyed. The next is a written recipe for that dish, including the ingredients, ideally as specific as possible, although most people find that there's sort of a common imprecision to it. Oh, I add a pinch of this or a handful of that, or I just do it until it tastes right. This is one of the most wonderful aspects, I think, of living recipes, is that tension in trying to get somebody to be precise about something that is often muscle memory or a taste sensation. How do you verbalize and quantify that knowledge? That tension is at the heart of the crux of the matter, and yet it's also important. How do you cook it? What are the steps? What are the tools that you need? What are the temperatures and the instruments that you need? In an ideal world, you might ask your person to cook with you. You're in the kitchen with them, feeling it, tasting it, smelling it in that embodied apprentice way. And that might also go a long way towards preserving it in yourself, as well as creating an external record of it. The last is a visual archive. So maybe you think about filming the process of cooking a particular dish, or photographing key elements, the process as it's being made, and the serving of it, and the consumption of it. So this living recipe then has these elements that are textual and aesthetic and hopefully embodied. Altogether, these different ways of thinking about food and heritage, whether it's the deep meanings and memories that are ingrained from the time we're children and that we carry through with us in our lives as we think about the meaning and presence of food in our family dynamics, as we saw in the example of the Farm Labor Oral History Project, whether we see and understand the way food figures more prominently in our senses of identity and our cultural attachments at local, regional, state, and even national levels. And then finally, as we think about the ways in which these practices, which are so intimate to us, which we do hold so dear, as we think about ways that we can preserve those for ourselves and for future generations, we come to realize and think about the ways that food is at the heart of our sense of self, at the heart of our sense of family, and of our community.